Good afternoon. Once again, it's Lee McClure, cybersecurity instructor at WazU. Welcome to the first lecture workshop on cryptography and access management, a course that began just yesterday. Um, this is in the 2-week program model, so and like with all of those courses, we will cover the first 5 lessons in today's lecture, and then next week, as we finish up the course, I'll cover the last 5 lessons. This course, especially the first part of it, is actually one of my favorite parts of the, I like all kinds of parts of the program. Um, but this course, the cryptography stuff is so fun. I actually kind of, as a young kid, got into cryptography very early on. Crackerjack rings and decoder rings and stuff like that. Plus, reading whatever Hardy Boys and mysteries and different novels and trying to figure out how to beat certain ciphers. And even using a little bit of the cryptography and cipher, if you will, when I was passing notes. I didn't want to, when I was a kid, have anybody read my note except for the people who were supposed to read my note. And so, of course, cryptography has come a long way from those very simple origins and those simple things that I played with as a kid to the very complex cryptological systems we use today to secure e-commerce and all those kinds of activities. And so the first 4 lessons of this class are primarily about the history and getting you up to speed on cryptography and how it's used and how it came about. Excuse me, allergies here in Texas today, so weather changes again. So we're going to cover the first 5, which is going to cover the first four, which are on Introduction to Cryptography Concepts. Lesson 2 is all about some common algorithms that we have used historically. Then we're going to talk about something really important called the states of data and how we can use cryptography to protect those. Lesson 4 is a kind of segue into wireless cryptography, talking about some of those protocols and standards. And then lesson 5, we begin to get in and talk about access control. But because so much of access control is dependent upon cryptography, and we think about it like from network foundations, or when we set up SSH, we connect with an encryption algorithm to our VM like we did in network foundations. That's the way cloud deployments are done today. You spin up a virtual machine in the cloud, you have it generate a key pair, it injects the public key into the VM, and you download the private key, set it up with your PuTTY or whatever terminal, SSH client you're using, and you then connect, and those keys match, and it lets you log on. And you don't even have a username and password in that concept. And of course, a lot of other VPN, remote access type of stuff, it really underlying, depends on understanding, at least high level, how cryptography works. So we're going to come back, even though there's only 4, and you would think this class would be split 5 and 5. It is kind of, because a couple, especially like lesson 10, comes back to what's called the PKI, the public key infrastructure, if you're really using public-private key encryption as part of an enterprise environment. So we come back to cryptography and kind of touch on it on and off again throughout other chapters that aren't that are more in the access control part. So thus the name, they go together. Cryptography underlies so much of what we do. Think about when you log into Amazon and your browser creates that secure connection for you using cryptography, so you can pass your credentials and you can pass your credit card information and things like that without anybody ostensibly being able to eavesdrop. So we can see that access controls and cryptography really go hand in hand. So when we talk about cryptography, what are we talking about if we start with lesson 1? Well, quite simply, we're talking about taking plain text, normal human readable type of information, and messing it all up in such a way that it's encoded, it's encrypted, it's been changed. We change it into something we call ciphertext. And so you may have even in your life probably have gotten an email that maybe was encrypted, or maybe had an encrypted or compressed, encoded type of file, like a MIME file attachment or something. You see all these strange characters and things, and you can't make it out. You have no, it's not human readable. But there would generally be some type of algorithm or process that you could go through to decode or decrypt that information. So what we're talking about in cryptography is encrypting and encoding information in such a way that it's no longer human readable, and ideally in such a way that it's so mathematically secure that no one else can read it either. And there are a lot of reasons we would use cryptography, actually. In the modern world, we obviously use it. Think about back to our original security foundations and the 3 promises we make as part of cybersecurity: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And cryptography can play a role in all of those. Obviously, if we encrypt a confidential file, then only the people who have the code or the key or the access can decrypt that file and gain that information. So we're helping with confidentiality. A lot of times we encrypt stuff on the file system. On newer phones, you can encrypt everything on them for security, right? Probably heard about some of that kind of stuff. So obviously keeping confidentiality. Integrity could be the same way. It's probably in some ways, I mean, there's an element of it helping in all three areas, but maybe it's a little bit the weakest in integrity, except that because of one aspect of at least modern cryptography is not only that we can encrypt data so it's not readable by people we don't want to read, but because of the way the math works, which we'll explain a little later, we can also pretty much prove who did it. So there could be a way that you can use like cryptography logins. Then, okay, well, this key logged into this machine and then made that change of data, and we can track that, you know, Lee logged in and made that change, and so we can maintain the integrity. Or if somebody else logs in, then makes a change, then there's a violation of that integrity there. And so what happened? Did somebody steal keys? Did they actually crack the algorithm? What happened to make that happen? So there is an element of integrity. And then, funny enough, about availability. In this modern day, so many of us, I'm a prime example, and so are my students. My students are all over the country. They have been in every time zone of the United States, and WazU has students in foreign, you know, through partners. And late last year, we graduated a class, or a partner graduated the first class of full stack people on the WazU program in Africa. And we're going to see more and more of that. And of course, I have done private thing, you know, done things in other parts. I've done webinars, and you know, we can touch people all over the world. And so that's just the way we work from home, we work remote, we work flex time. We need to be able to access a data center on the other side of the world. And so cryptography allows us to provide that availability, because we obviously don't want somebody, you know, maybe our remote database engineer lives in Florida and we need them to be able to access, you know, the data centers in Seattle or something. And we don't want anybody to do that. We have to make it available to that person. So we can issue them a key and allow them to connect in and authenticate against using that cryptography system, and thus theoretically make it available, but also protecting the confidentiality and integrity along the way. Now, there are a few other terms that you may have never heard outside of this context, but because of, once again, and we're talking about the modern cryptography here, particularly the public-private key we'll talk about. But with that methodology, we can do a number of other things that work in hand sort of with those bigger promises. One of the things is we can ensure what's called non-refudiation. If you have used a cryptography standard in your own key and your recipient's key, and you've encrypted that message, not only is that message encrypted, so ideally only that recipient can decode it and read it, but also because your key was used in the encryption mechanism, it is a way of digitally signing. And so you can't claim that it wasn't you that said it, you know, unless somebody stole your keys again. And so assuming security of keys in an enterprise environment, if an email comes from the VP saying XYZ and it's digitally signed, then this is one way you could theoretically stop, say, spear phishing, because the spear fisher is not going to have that key. They might spoof and make it look like this email to the admin or accounting person was coming from a VP and they needed to transfer $1,000. But if those keys didn't match, then we can make sure that, you know, that we can attest. That's attestation as well. We can attest that that person did send that mail, or that person can't, you know, say I didn't send it later, because there'll be a trail. Now, of course, and we'll get there. Let's back up a little bit before we get too deep. We didn't start with these fancy schmancy systems. Most people would say, and I'm sure there were probably some degree, and there arguably are other codes that go back to even earlier civilizations. There's some argument that some of the tablets and papyrus and different ancient writings of ancient civilizations were done in some degree of a code so that information could be maintained secure. Some of those codes have been broken and some haven't. We still don't know what some of these scrawls on some of these blocks back in history say, though some people speculate that there were codes being used. But really the most well-known, at least in the sort of modern history, when we're talking the Roman Empire forward, is something called the Caesar cipher. The Caesar cipher is something, and there are variants of this theme, a bunch of them. But in the big picture, they are basically just offset algorithms is what it comes down to. So for example, if we think about the classic English alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, et cetera, down to Z, you can use those letters like we normally do, right, to spell out words. Well, what if we wanted to encrypt a message? Well, one of the easiest ways would be to basically offset. And so if we're going to write hi Lee, and we're going to use an offset of 3, then instead of the H, we'd have to go H-I-J-K. So we'd write K. And then instead of the I, we would have to be, so we got H-I, so we got to go K-L. So we would write K-L instead of H-I. Then a space, and then an L, and of course M and O. Okay, we write O, and then D-E-F, so we do O-F-F. So it would be, yeah, I got that right, L-K-L, OFF would be Hi Lee with a 3 offset. That, in the simplest terms, is basically what the Caesar cipher was. And so Caesar and his generals, theoretically, they were the only people who knew what the pattern was. And I don't know, maybe the pattern was if a message is written on a particular day, maybe it's the day of the week, and that's how many the offset was. But you could come up with any kind of scheme. But as long as the general knows that when they get this gobbledygook, this ciphertext, that they instead translate it by offsetting back or offsetting left or right, whichever the pattern is. That's what a Caesar cipher is. And so if I wrote out a long paragraph of text and did that offset, it's going to look like, what the heck is that, right? That doesn't make any sense. There's no words that I can read in there. So even the courier, if they tried to peek in the message, or somebody stole that message along the way from Caesar to his general or back and forth, they wouldn't be able to read it without knowing what the key was. The general, on the other hand, would go, okay, it's the second day of the month, it's the second day of the week, I offset by 2, and can decipher the message. Now, this was hugely powerful to Caesar, but of course, it's actually fairly easy to figure out. As a matter of fact, as we learn as we move into lesson 2, we talk about a number of other types of keys. And to be honest, because of limited time for one, and there's so many of them in just an hour time block to try to cover, and I've got numerous other lessons here, I don't want to talk about all the other types, but there are other types of sort of seizure or offset counters. There is one name that's V-I-G-E-R or N-E-R with a tilde, and everybody always asks me what it is. My best assumption, and this is doing some research for students that have asked multiple times, is it's Vigenère. Doesn't look like it, but it's French. So there's the Caesar or Vigenère ciphers. There are basically what's happening with the Vigenère is instead of having a particular offset that we use consistently throughout, we actually change the offset for every letter we use. Now this is a more complex code that has to be passed along the key to figure out that pattern, but it's also much harder for somebody just to try to sit down and look. Now, the problem is there's others. There's the rail fence, the pig pen, there's other kind of Enigma, got more complex, and that's where we start when we talk about the World War II Enigma machine, start to get to something more complex that obviously took a lot more than just sort of simple figuring out the pattern. But that's the problem with all these other ciphers. If you really sit down and start playing with it, and this is what I got into as a kid. I did this as a very young kid. There'd be some cipher in some mystery novel or some children's book or Hardy Boys or whatever, and I'd want to figure it out. And so I had done some research, and I learned maybe even through, I think, Boy Scouts or something else, some other place I ran into this, like, using it, the ciphers being used militarily. I'm kind of a military buff, history buff. So I've run into ciphers before, did some more research, and realized something that we teach you in this program, which is something called frequency analysis. The idea is that if you get a page of text, and it's got all this what seems to be gobbledygook, but what you, or even could be weird characters like the pig pen example in the lesson, or any other characters. It could be any kind of emojis, whatever the case is. If there's a pattern to it, though, if it's offset, replacement, basically what we call a substitution cipher, where instead of putting L, we put some other value, and instead of E, we put some other value, and we put E, we put some other, but we're going to have to use the same one in these substitutions. So for offsetting, then we were using, instead of E, we were using FG8, so we were using HH to be the E with the 3 offset, but we're going to use it the same. And so this is where their weakness. They're simple and they're easy to do with these offset ciphers. I used them in school and actually never had, a few times I did get a note taken up as a young kid. They just, what is this? They just throw it away. But they could have broken it with a little effort. And the simple math to it is the fact, or the simple analysis of it is, what you do is you sit down and you look at that sample of text, the cipher text you're trying to break, and you count up all the instances of the symbols. You do a frequency analysis. Why do we do that? Well, because people have been studying English, and if you're doing this in another language, it applies. If it's a substitute cipher, you could break a Chinese substitute cipher, even in their, letters, if you knew the appropriate analysis and did the appropriate analysis. Keeping it to English for the moment. In English, the most common letter in the English language is the letter E. And then followed by is T, A, O, and I. So only one consonant, T, makes the top 5. The others are obviously common vowels because they show up in all kinds of words we say, right? So now how does this help you? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. So you've counted up all the symbols, and whether those are hash marks, tick marks, Chinese symbols, emojis, it doesn't matter. If it's a substitute cipher you're trying to break, then once you count up all the symbols and you do the frequency analysis and you order them by the most commonly occurring symbol, the odds are that that most common symbol, whether it's a star or a Chinese character, assuming we're doing a substitution cipher in English, that's going to be the letter E. And so what you can do is go back to the original cipher and look for, like, say, 3-letter words that have that symbol at the end. That's very likely the, right? T-H-E. Or maybe there's 2-letter words like B, or even 3-letter words like C, S-E-E. And, if you see that same symbol and you start trying to plug them in, and then basically as soon as you do that, and maybe it's a little off because you got a smaller sample size, so maybe the second most common in your frequency shows up and you substitute that for E. Once you've done that, it's almost like kind of reverse filling out a crossword puzzle. Once you have some of the letters, you can start to guess what the word is. So if we know that a whole bunch of words throughout end with that symbol we think is E, so we think that's E, then we can think that that's one in front of it's probably H, and the one in front of that's probably T. And since T is one of the more common, that's also would probably be one of the higher frequency symbols on our analysis. And we just start replacing and substituting in. And after a while, it all just falls apart, because once you've gotten a handful of letters that you've successfully replaced, then now you're beginning to fill in words, 2, 3, 4-letter words. And then at that point, now you're up to half the letters you've replaced. And then all of a sudden, like I said, it's just a crossword puzzle to figure out the last few words that are in there. And it becomes fairly easy to decipher these types of things. So, and then there's the other weakness that we have to exchange the key, right? So what the Germans did with their Enigma machine was build a much more complex thing that sort of took elements of Pinochet's polyalphabetic, where we weren't having the same offset. It wasn't as simple. It was much more complicated. But what they had to do was build these machines, and then they had to have them at both ends. They were like the encoding and decoding black boxes, and they would turn some dials and adjust things. And when they typed in the letters, it would cause the hammers to type weird symbols, but only the person theoretically on the other end who had the dial set to the same thing could then decipher it back out. And they would type in those letters and get back the original lesson. Now, of course, as we know, if you've ever watched that story and know about Alan Turing, they figured out how to ultimately, by building another machine, to analyze all the patterns and basically do still a substitution type of cipher kind of model. We'll attack it, we'll try all these different combos until it finally makes sense and we see the pattern of how it's done and how it changes over time. And they got to where they were pretty dependably able to break the Enigma machine's codes, and the Allies had a huge advantage in the later years of the war, knowing what was going on from the Germans. So there, it was a much more complex than a simple cipher, but technology was applied, even in early days technology, to beat it. And then in addition, the ability to, I think the Allies gained their hands on one, so that gave them at least some idea and some facts about how it was set up and configured. And then they just had to keep cranking at it and crunching the numbers till they figured out the pattern. So, but there were twofold problems. Substitution ciphers, even complex substitution ciphers, given enough processing power, can be broken. The patterns can be figured out. The other problem is that whether it's a machine or a code book or whatever, that has to be exchanged between the recipient and the sender and the recipient. Otherwise, there's no communication because now neither one, the other side can't decode it. They get a bunch of junk and they're like, well, what's this mean? I don't know how to do it. You've changed the pattern on me. So we've got to communicate that. So you see in the spy novels, the spy books, people making exchanges and passing code books and things like that. And, or the generals going to a code book so they could decipher the message that had just come in from headquarters. In some cases, like in a military case, it's maybe fairly simple to secure with soldiers and safe transport, out. But what if somebody overruns a base and they get those, then they might be able to read other codes, right? So all of this happened, from Caesar on up through sort of even as we got into modern times in World War II, not that many years ago, right? Big machine, but ultimately and cryptographers kept working on more and more complex things. And as we got into the digital age, and especially to power what we have going on today, we couldn't depend on that kind of model. Think about it. If I had to contact Amazon and send them the key so that we could communicate with each other with the HTTPS and that nice little lock sign, Amazon would have never grown to be as big as it is. It had to have phone conversations or email, real hardcore, postal mail. And, of course, then if somebody had stolen that letter, then they could impersonate you and stuff like that. So how did we get past that? Well, we came up with something called public-private key infrastructure. And just real quickly, because we'll talk about it more, and you're actually going to do some exercises that help you calculate it at a very high level. But it's really some really fancy math. But basically what happens, and that's what you did in Network Foundations, is you created a public-private key pair for you. And so you had one, you left the public key on the server, and you had the private key on your machine. And then because those two are mathematically tied and one only goes with the other, that server, when you tried to connect, you would say, I have the private key that matches that public key, and it would let you in. So that's one aspect. Now, it goes further than that when we talk about it, though, like from the point of view of, let's say you and I were going to have a communication with each other. Well, I will have created a public and private key, and so will you. And then what happens is we can exchange the public keys. They're public. We don't care if anybody gets them. It's only half of the equation. We have to keep our private. Very secure in this model, though. That becomes the weak link, is maintaining security of the private keys. But the way the math works is that if I want to send you a message that only you can decode, then what I'm going to use is my private key and your public key, and I'm going to use them to encrypt it. Mathematically, it's going to use a combination of my private and your public, and it's going to do the transform and turn it into ciphertext. When I send that to you, there is only one combination of keys that can decrypt it, and it's the opposite. It's my public key, which I can freely give you, and it's your private key. So you're the only person. Anybody else could get my public key, but only you can decrypt because you have a private key and you have my public. You have to have both of those pieces. And when you want to send me back a message, you use your private key and my public key to decrypt. Then I have to have your counterbalancing public key, and I, of course, have my private key, which balances my public key. And this is the way this stuff works. This is how we can do basically Amazon. Because what happens is when your browser goes to Amazon, your browser has its own. You may not even know this, but your browser has its own key. It created it as part of the install. So your browser has a public key and a private key. Public key it can give to any website out there. Doesn't matter. So when it goes to Amazon, part of that first TCP HTTP connection, HTTPS connection, is it's going to say, hi, Amazon, here's my key. And Amazon's going to give you its public key. Now, there is a step that happens in the background you don't even see, and we'll talk about it later in the lessons, but it goes out and checks with what's called a certificate authority, somebody who signed that key to validate it's Microsoft or it's Amazon or it's your bank or whoever. And so your browser will do a quick check and say, hey, I just got this key. Is this who it claims to be? And they'll do their math and come back and tell your browser, yes, I signed that key. I issued that key to Amazon. That is Amazon.com. And at that point, you trust this key. You know that's Amazon. Amazon's going to trust you. They don't really have much choice. There's no way to validate you until later once you log in. But from the cryptography point of view, now what will happen is just like that same thing. Your private key And Amazon's public key can be used to encrypt a message to Amazon, like your login information. Amazon, which has your public key you provided, and of course has its own private key, can decrypt that message, then send you back the information. And once that initial authentication and logon happens, basically, then what happens is we actually, because that's pretty heavy, a lot of math to do that public-private crossing over and matching the keys. So we really, in today's world, don't use it consistently throughout the entire transaction. What we do is we establish the connection, we establish the validity of that is Amazon.com, we exchange credentials, and then ultimately Amazon, the website, will send us back, funny enough, an old school key that we're going to use, and everything that gets sent from that point on is going to be more of a standard asymmetrical encryption, which is faster than the symmetrical encryption of public-private key. You're going to learn about Alice and Bob and Evil Eve. It's an exercise that takes you through doing the math of public-private key encryption, and it's not that complex an exercise, but it is an enlightening one. It's sort of simplified down to not quite the level of accuracy that the modern keys are, but it gives you an idea of how, by having this public-private key, we can end up having a communication that no one else can eavesdrop on. Now, lesson 3, real quickly, is the states of data. We talked about in the very beginning that our job is to protect our corporation's assets, our digital information, digital data. And so when you get down to it, data can be in one of 3 states. Data can be at rest. So when something like your resume or your transcript or whatever is sitting on a server somewhere, just sitting in digital ones and zeros on a backup disk or on a hard drive, that's what we call at rest. Now, obviously, we already mentioned it earlier, and rest is a great time to encrypt stuff. You can encrypt backups, you can encrypt your file system. That way, if somebody happens to, connect in through a network share or something, well, if they don't have the way to decrypt that data, they can't get it. So that helps protect confidentiality and potentially integrity too. If data, which is common in our world, especially this highly interconnected world we live in, if it's in motion, if it's being transmitted, it's being transmitted from the server to your machine, it's being transmitted from Amazon to your browser. That's data in motion, and we also just made that a good example. That's exactly how public-private key is used. So when you go to your bank, when you go to Amazon, we can set up a secure connection and encrypt everything end-to-end between our 2 client and server. So encryption, once again, plays a big role. The place where encryption generally falls down, actually, is when data is in use. Data has to be in use, right? So like, for example, I always use this example. We can store the accounting file encrypted 9 ways to Sunday. If we transmit that file to our accountant, we're going to encrypt that thing 9 ways to Sunday. But when our accountant or our payroll person or our accounts billables person inside of our company opens up our accounting software and pulls up a record, it can't be encrypted anymore, can it? I mean, they're looking at a form. It has the person's name, it has their transactions, it's an invoice, it's a bill, it's a whatever. And accountants and normal people can't read encryption. So when data's in use, when it's on that computer screen, that's when encryption doesn't have a role to play. It can't really, sadly. It might be encrypting the memory. So in case some virus was trying to grab that data, it might be encrypting the hard drive or the server or the transmission across the network. And it really should be in almost all cases. We need to use it, but we can't encrypt the screen. If we encrypt the screen, the user can't figure out, well, how much do they owe me? Which client is this? It's all gobbledygook, right? And so that's why in very, very secure environments, my wife works in one, you will find no cell phones allowed in there, no place to take pictures, because that's the one place that data now is open. It's just normal human readable text. So the states of data are very important to know, and to know where we can apply encryption and protections. And of course, in the case of the use case, data in use, we end up having to come up with other protections. We have to, have non-disclosure agreements with our employees. We have to ban their ability, like at that where she works, you can't bring USBs and plug them in because they don't want you to try to take files or data. You can't take a screenshot. They've disabled that ability, and you couldn't get it off even if you could, because of the way they've locked it down. They only allow internal email within the system. They do not let them outside to go to, say, Gmail, because once again, they could take a screenshot and send that file to themselves, or they could just start typing what they saw on the screen. Maybe that's a very high valuable account information, or maybe that's proprietary information. Maybe lots of different organizations. I had a student years ago used to work at one of the gaming companies that manages a lot of the lotteries. And once again, they had a lot of, if they let somebody in to work on real code, they had somebody standing right there watching over their shoulder what they were doing. And they had somebody else digitally logged into the system to watch, because while the code is in use, being modified, it can't be encrypted. You can't store it that you can store it that way, and you can even use it. You could have a decoder in your application if you had some special application, and it could still then run its process and serve out an answer. But when it serves information to an end user, a human, it has to be readable. So that's where our ability to use the states of data, or use encryption to protect the states of data falls. We can store it when we're storing it. When it's at rest, we can encrypt it. When it's in transit, we can encrypt it. When it's in use, not so much. So then lesson 4, I'm going to leave mainly to you. I know the student in question here doing really well. And 4 is pretty much a conceptual chapter talking about Wi-Fi encryption. When we connect to a Wi-Fi hotspot, just like when we connect from a browser to a secure web server, we're basically, at least can, and depending on the protocols in use, set up a secure connection between, so the data is encrypted. So nobody can just snarf that stuff off the air, like wireless packet capturing, and see our credit cards and see our information. This is actually one of the reasons that it's very advisable never to use unknown hotspots. Many times they're not set up as securely, or sometimes they are total fakes. I remember I get a kick out of looking around sometimes if I'm bored to see what other hotspots, but I hardly ever use any hotspots besides my own. I use Wi-Fi in my house. Yeah, I'm not a Luddite. I'm going to use Wi-Fi. If I'm out on the road, then I use my phone's 4G. And if I need to get my iPad or my laptop or something on, I'm going to turn on the hotspot on my phone, because I, at least to some degree, trust the people up the chain from me, from my providers. But I don't trust Starbucks. Nothing wrong with Starbucks, by the way. But if I'm in I don't trust the dentist office. I don't want to be on their Wi-Fi. I don't know how they configured it. I don't know if somebody's already hacked it. And actually, one of the times I was sitting at a Starbucks, and I don't drink coffee, but I do drink their tea occasionally. I had to meet somebody for a meeting, so I'm sitting there. They were late, so I'm flipping with my phone, looking at, and there was a Starbucks and a Starbucks 2, and that really struck my attention, because this wasn't a huge Starbucks zone. Why did it need 2 Wi-Fi hotspots? And so, using one of the Wi-Fi analyzer tools on my Android phone at the time, I basically, after the meeting was over, I went and confirmed with the manager. I'm like, you only have 1 hotspot here, right? And they're like, yeah, why? And I said, well, because there's 2 now. I said, and so then I went walking around the parking lot and watched the signal strength drop. And on one side, which turned out there was an apartment complex back here, somebody in one of those apartments had a hotspot they called Starbucks 2, and it was wide open. My assumption was that they were hoping you would jump on it, and because they controlled it, they could watch all your stuff, steal your passwords. I've seen that done. Somebody could be staying in a hotel and then create a second hotspot that was a fake hotspot that was the hotel, so that maybe they're trying to target somebody staying there, right? Hoping they're going to jump on that fake signal. So it's important to know, generally speaking, with Wi-Fi security, the best thing to say is use the highest setting. So we don't want to use WPE, we don't want to use WPA, we want to use WPA2, and even that is breakable these days, sadly. WPA3 is on the way. So as soon as it comes out, we'll no doubt want to use it, but then it'll find weaknesses. But use good passkeys. There's a debate about whether you hide your SID, your SSID, your signal ID. I know that even if you hide it, the right tools, you can find it, so I don't bother to hide it. I have it secured, so none of my neighbors can just jump on mine. As a matter of fact, I like to see mine and theirs, and sometimes I'll adjust. If I see my Wi-Fi is acting a little weird, it may be because the neighbors has jumped on the same channel as mine, or maybe they bought a new IoT device or a new router, and it's causing an issue. It's so funny, because when I started with Wi-Fi years and years ago, I was the first person on my block that had a Wi-Fi adapter, Wi-Fi A. And I could literally, even with that crappy early signal and not much speed, but it had a decent signal, I could go like to the 3 or 4 houses down this way to the end of the block, and I could go about halfway, which is multiple houses down that street, and I still, finally, it would drop my Wi-Fi. Now today, if I leave my yard, it's gone, because everybody has multiple Wi-Fis. They have their Wi-Fi from their router and their home internet connection. Some of them, like me, have additional Wi-Fis. Some of us have printers that allow Wi-Fi direct printing. So just in my house, there's multiple Wi-Fi sources, and my neighbors are all pretty much the same. And so I've watched that, the Wi-Fi, because their signals are conflicting with mine. I'll even, at least thankfully the guy over on this side of my house is a techie geek. So one time I just walked over, talked to him, and said, "Hey, Wi-Fi is a little weak on my side of the house. What'd you do?" And he's like, "Oh, I got a new blah blah blah." I'm like, "Okay, what channel are you on?" And we adjusted it. But I'm off. We're talking about Wi-Fi cryptography. Now, they do use a version of the public-private key as part of that. And actually, it is in lesson 4 where you will meet Alice and Bob and do the math. Then lesson 5, as we wrap up for today, is about access control concepts. And we talk about, now that we know how we can encrypt things, and this applies to remote access and all kinds of things, but it also just applies to logging into a network, right? What are we going to do? What are the steps involved in access control? Well, as pointed out in lesson 5, we have a number of steps. One of them is to identify. So when the first part of a username password field, that's your identification. My username is XYZ. That's to identify you on the network. Then you, of course, provide a password. That is to authenticate you on the network. Then, based on and this is where like IT/security comes in. The usernames and passwords, maybe there's a password policy that says what it should be, and maybe IT gives out usernames, but usually they're pretty common. They're abbreviated names like T. Lee McJr., L. McWhorter, or whatever they are. And so that's very common. So, but the ID is my username. The authentication is my password, or potentially multi-factor, right? Maybe a dongle, or having to put in a code from an app. But whatever, that's the identification and authentication part of access control. But then the next part, which is definitely handled by IT and security, is the authorization part. So, for example, if you log into a site, a corporate site particularly, maybe you're running web-based accounting software. Not uncommon, actually. I mean, are you using Salesforce.com? Or heck, a lot of companies use Office in the cloud, Outlook 360, right? Or Office 360 in the cloud. So you're using Outlook and you're using email. And our organization does, for example, WasU. So when I log in with my username and I use my password. And then when I am authorized to run all the apps and do everything, but I am not an admin on that network. But I know, because I manage other clients that use Google Apps or use where I am the admin. If I log in with an admin account, then I can create new users and do things as opposed to just being my own user. That's the authorization part. And it's the same thing like when somebody's, onboarded at a company, you'll create them a username, maybe a temp password, have them go change it later. But then you're going to go into your settings on your software, like Active Directory for Windows, for example, and you're going to join them to groups, and you're going to give them permissions to different printers, to different network shares, to different servers. And that is the authorization part. That is controlled on the back end. Users don't generally get to pick their own authorization, right? They might get to pick their username, maybe not. They may get to pick their password. Once again, maybe not, but usually from memory. But then what access is assigned to that account is handled by the IT and the security folks based on policy and based on balancing confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That person is accountant. They need access to the accounting data. They don't need access to the software repository, right? So that's all handled on that backside by that piece. And so we have all different kinds. We can have admins, we can have authors, we can have read-only access. As we've seen in our program, Windows has, basic security just on your desktop. You can have read-only files, hidden files, system files, and you can have multiple users. Maybe it's not uncommon in a lot of homes that the parents have an account or multiple accounts, but then the kids log into their own account, or they've been restricted through parental controls as to what they can see and what they can surf and what they can do, right? This is all access control concepts. And so in corporations, though, we're not worried about parental control, even though there's sometimes an element of that where we maybe block employees from installing new software because of the security risk. We block them from going to certain sites because of the data leakage risk. All these things have to be thought through and ultimately put into policy. But there are a number of different types of access, and we will look at, I think this is all in this chapter. Let me look at double checking my notes. Well, we'll talk about more of the models back in next week in chapter 7, but there are a lot of different models. Is it role-based? Is it mandatory? Is it discretionary? All these different types of models. So this is still, but then the rest of the stuff is how this impacts corporate policy. You obviously have to have certain policies, and we've talked about those from the beginning through the frameworks and the templates that we use to build our organizational security policy. We're going to need things like AUP, acceptable use policy. This is part of our control for access control. You can only use these for these things. Why do we have that? Even if ostensibly we're setting up all the permissions right? Well, because somebody might mess up. And so then if you gave somebody who didn't need access to some critical server, hopefully the acceptable use policy is a layer of defense, right? It's, they find they have access and they go, whoa, I'm not supposed to be here, and they tell IT, as opposed to go, ooh, look what I got into and look what I can snag. So hopefully your people are following your policy and you have good people, right? But you want those things. You want password policy. You have to figure out how this is going to work. Like if you have all this in place, very substantial access controls, so that when people come into their office, they log into their computer and it gives them access to everything. How does that impact if the network goes down or this building goes down, right? And when we talked about, once again, back in Security Foundation, things like disaster planning and recovery and things like that, we have to factor these things in, not only in the running of our company, but in those worst case scenario plans for our company, our business contingency planning. We better have a backup login server somewhere, or maybe we're going to move to a login server in the cloud, or login authentication, single sign-on in the cloud. These are all things we have to take into mind. And so I think that's it. I'm pretty good. So when we go wrong page. So that's the first 5. The first 4 are all about cryptography, cool stuff there. And then we just sort of introduce the access controls here in lesson 5. Next week, we will talk further about risk management, because we've talked about it high level, but this gets a little more practical. And it's part of, like I've said before, actually, we use risk management to underlie everything we do in security. Do we have a risk? Well, we have a website and there's web hackers, so we have a risk. Well, how do we know whether we want to throw a lot of money at fixing that or a lot little money? Well, we have to look. If we're Amazon and make billions a year, then we better protect our web. If we're a small pizza place that just has our menu online, yeah, we're going to lose some sales. Maybe it look bad if somebody puts a Guy Fawkes mask on our website. But as long as we have a good backup and monitoring and we can get it restored quickly, then there's no credit card data there. There's no personal information. Amazon risk a lot more, right? So we have to do that risk analysis. And the same thing applies as we start talking about access controls. How or who are we going to give access to? We got to use that least privilege we learned, those basic principles, right? So we want to give people just the access they need to do their job, and ideally no more. And so we don't want to just throw everybody in the admin group, because that makes it easy. Because then if a malicious player or even a non, they just make a mistake. They get the virus on their machine and it encrypts everything and runs off and encrypts your whole corporate network because they have rights everything. Yeah, it's kind of bad, right? So we don't want to do that. So we got to use, so we're going to cover more about risk management, and particularly how it fits into the 7 domains in IT, and how it fits into how we assign permissions in different areas, etc. We're going to talk about some of the different access control systems I mentioned, like whether something's we're using access control list, we're using the discretionary model, a mandatory model, etc. We're going to talk about securing. We've talked about it at a high level. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more about securing the 3 states of data. And then in 9, we're going to talk about implementing access controls, followed by the last lesson kind of brings it all back together, because we started off with cryptography. We talked a lot about access controls. And then when you bring those together, you're talking about public key infrastructure, PKI. That is like in a corporation environment, we're going to need key servers and certificate authorities so that we can sign our own keys and validate that Lee is Lee, because that was issued by IT and security and it's been signed and it's stored on a server. There's private keys here, is public accessible. And that way, like if I want to send a mail and we're going to have this be encrypted, it can all be done behind the scenes because I have my private key. And when I pick a user just to send the mail to, it can pull their key off the key server, all of this fancy stuff. And you'll get a high level overview of all that. And a little bit, another visit, I believe, with Alice and Bob as we work through the math of how that actually works. So that's next week. This week was cryptography 1 through 4, and then the intro to access controls. And then we'll talk more about access management, risk management, and related topics, and wrap it all up with PKI infrastructure next week. This is my last of 3 workshops today. I have downloaded one of them, and I'll start uploading it. And then I probably should, after this is done, I should have the next. As always, it take a little time to finish. Once they finish processing, I can download them, get them posted, and update the link. I'll see a bunch of you, just about everybody on. Well, I'll see some tomorrow and most of you on Thursday for one-on-ones and office hours as needed. Hope you have a good day. Thanks.